Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the pregame show of our final tournament of the year, the StarCityGames.com Players Championship here at the Star City Games Center in Roanoke, Virginia. Cedric Phillips, Patrick Sullivan,
Good morning.
Matthias Hunt,
Good morning.
and Emma Handy.
That's me.
All four of us have been covering the SCG Tour all year long, but we've actually never done a show together. We kind of made it so that Matthias and Emma are on one side, because Matthias given your experience, and Patrick and I were on the other, and we were, of course, working alongside Craig Krempels, Brian Gottlieb, Todd Anderson, Ryan Overturf, and at the early portions of this year, Jerry Thompson. So the 9 of us have had the opportunity to watch these 16 players do their thing all year long, and what a year it has been, Patrick.
Oh, and this event is like no other. We've covered it now several times, and it's the culmination of a year's work for a lot of these players, grinding through opens for the better part of a year, or at least a half a year to get some of these invites. For some of these players, spiking an invitational to get here. Yep. But for everyone, this is the culmination of a lot of effort, a lot on the line, and what is fun for me about this event is watching sort of that competitive spirit and solidarity among the players. Obviously, a lot on the line that they're playing for, but everyone here appreciates the work that everyone else put in getting here, and you see a lot of, like I said, solidarity amongst the players, a lot of hugs and handshakes as people get eliminated, all the way culminating to an eventual champion. This is a very special event to cover.
Matthias, your fourth time covering this event as well. It's a lot of high pressure, but I think I agree with Patrick that it's also somewhat fun to watch the players kind of battle against each other.
Yeah, this is my favorite event of the year. I'm really glad to have this event back after a 3-year break from it. But yeah, we first of all get some of the best players on the tour competing in this event, which they compete all weekend. And actually, one of the things I really like about it is just how the feeling of this is different than any other tournament we have. So first of all, it's a 3-day event as opposed to 2 days. And on top of that, the high-pressure matches start from almost the beginning of it. Normally in a tournament, you have to be rising to the top, but the Players' Championship's a little bit different in that it's more you just have to not fall off the back. So as the tournament progresses, slowly players get eliminated until only one remains. And I know speaking with players like Brad Nelson winning this before, talking about how this tournament just really can take a tax on the players as far as just keeping their energy level high for the entire weekend.
Well, Emma, you've had a pretty nice competitive year of playing Magic yourself, in addition to doing commentary. I know you've never played in this tournament before and your first time covering it, but what are you looking forward to here this weekend for this one?
So I think something that Patrick brushed on was the camaraderie and talking about the energy of this event. There's just a certain level of everyone is so excited to be here that you don't get with a lot of tournaments, and it's incredibly unique to this. I've personally never been here for this event before, and it's just been something else and something that I've never seen at any of the other tournaments I've participated in between, Pro Tours, Mythic Championships, even the arena ones. Everyone here is just so ready.
Well, it's going to be a lot of fun watching these 16 players play all weekend long over the course of 3 days of competition. Now, we do want to start things off with a bit of a metagame breakdown. We've got 3 different formats here that we are going to be watching, and we're going to go to Legacy at the very end because that's actually how the day is going to start. So let's kick things off with a format I think most people, it's front of mind for them, and it's standard given the Mythic Championship that took place last weekend in Long Beach. I had the pleasure of being there and covering that event, and while I was there, I got to see these decks in action. Simic Ramp, Simic Flash, Jund Sacrifice, and Gari Adventures. This is kind of your breakdown of what the players are playing here this weekend among the 16 of them, and the most played deck is going to be Simic Ramp, the deck that Andrea Mengucci took to a 4th place finish. Emma, I'm going to start with you. We've got a deck that has a lot of ramp, some payoffs in Cavalier of Thorns and Hydroid Krasis. Nissa, who shakes the world, still obviously very good. And though Oko and Once Upon a Time and Veil Silver were banned, Simic is still a thing that people can do.
Yeah, so there's actually a really great synergy just with Nissa, who shakes the world, and a lot of the other cards, right? We have these push cards, Nissa, who shakes the world, Hydroid Krasis, and then the prevalence of Aether Gust in particular. Yep. That card is great with Nissa, who shakes the world, due to her synergy with Breeding Pool. Yep. It sort of gives you this ability to have a 2-mana reactive spell on the back of your unbeatable proactive 5-drop that's really, really strong.
Yeah, that deck, it's very straightforward, Matthias, and what it's looking to do. Andrea Mengucci's plan last weekend was just to go over the top of everyone. There are really no straightforward aggressive decks, and as we saw in our metagame breakdown, they're not here either. The most aggressive deck we're going to see is called Gari Adventures, which we'll get to in just a little bit here on our metagame breakdown. So going over the top, have Finale of Devastation to search for either Agent of Treachery or End-Raze Forerunners. It's straightforward, but it appears to be pretty good.
Yeah, the deck's certainly powerful. It gets to play some of the most powerful cards in Standard. I'm actually interested to see so many players end up on this deck. It was the winning deck from last weekend, but at the same time, especially in this metagame where we really just have 3 decks, I'm not sure how it's going to perform in Standard this weekend. The Simic deck's very powerful, but it doesn't interact very well, and especially against something like these Rakdos, these sacrifice decks, I think that might actually be a liability. The other 2 popular decks, I think both can hang with Simic Ramp, and I'm going to be interested to see whether or not this deck that almost half the field is registered is actually the winner.
Yeah, that's kind of the question, right? Is you've got these decks, Patrick and Simic Flash and Jund Sacrifice, that can actually interact with Simic Ramp, where Simic Ramp is just trying to do one thing every time. Ramp up to a big handful of spells, large Hydroid Crisis, get this on the battlefield, so on and so forth, where these other decks are looking to interact. Ramp decks, I mean, sometimes you can go over the top, and that was Mengucci's plan last weekend. How do you think it's going to fare given what the rest of the metagame looks like?
Well, I still think it's a very powerful selection for this weekend, and I think it's a fine choice. I think Hydroid Crisis can create this incentive structure where there's really no cap on what you can do with your mana. You can't really flood out. And once you have that sort of incentive structure in place, often the thing to do is just accrue as many resources as possible. And Growth Spiral contributes to that. Nissa, Who Shakes the World, contributes to that, and then you can sort of finish the game out at your leisure. The proactive elements of the format, even if these decks aren't aggressive, the proactive elements of the format, I think, are just a lot more powerful than the reactive ones. And the Simic Ramp deck is fundamentally a proactive deck. There's not a whole lot of read and response to what's going on the other side of the battlefield. It's just get a bunch of mana, accumulate some extra resources, and then win the game with some of your haymakers.
Well, we're going to see if those haymakers do come to fruition over the course of the day. Again, 7 players are playing Simic Ramp here, but there's another Simic deck as well that our colleague and friend, everyone knows Brad Nelson at this point, doesn't normally play counterspells. Jonathan Hobbs certainly does, though, so it's not much of a surprise to see that this will be his standard deck of choice. It is Simic Flash. Brad Nelson getting second place at the Mythic Championship last weekend. Seth Manfield, Javier Dominguez, all making day number 3 of competition, the top 8 in Long Beach last weekend. You see the deck list here. You're not going to see anything too crazy going on with regards to changes to what Brad was doing along with Seth and Javier. So you've got, it's kind of a weird Flash deck insofar as it can play on the main phase as well because it does have copies of Nissa and Hydroid Crisis, but you've got counter spells like Quench, Ether Gust, stuff like that. So Matthias, I'll start with you. This kind of Flash-based strategy that also does have Frilled Mystic and Nightpick Ambusher. It's looking to do a little bit of everything, but those Mana Acceleration cards in Paradise Druid and Growth Spiral is kind of what put this deck over the top for those 3 players in Long Beach.
Yeah, I actually like this deck for this weekend. So I'm thinking about our main 2 decks, or the other 2 decks, of Simic Ramp and our Sacrifice deck. And I think in a lot of ways, post-board, the Simic Ramp deck is kind of going to try to get lower to the ground, get some more interaction. And so in a lot of ways, the Simic Flash deck feels like it is pre-boarded for the matchups that it already wants to be playing in this. So between the 2 Simic decks, I actually prefer this one. And for the 4 players that registered it, I think now that we've seen the metagame breakdown, they have the deck.
Now, Patrick, I asked you this question with the Simic Flash deck. One of the things that Brad and Javier and Seth were able to do last weekend in Long Beach was kind of take the tournament by surprise because people didn't expect a Flash deck to be coming into the field. They had a great matchup against Fires of Invention, which you will note. There are no one playing that deck here this weekend, which is somewhat notable. Paulo making top 8 of Mythic Championship last weekend with Jeskai Fires. You were able to prey on that deck. They're not able to prey there, but they have matchups against Simic Ramp and Jund Sacrifice. How do you think this is for a metagame call?
I think that you're still assuming that your matchup against the classic build of Simic is positive, then it's worth still playing. Obviously, you'd be a little disappointed about the lack of fires here, but I think the deck is still structured in a way that's smart against the traditional builds of Simic. You get to play a little bit of a lower and leaner game. The counterspells answer. At the end of the day, the Simic Ramp deck only has a handful of payoff cards. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of setup and then 8 or 9 live cards. If you have counterspells for that, you have a couple very efficient flash creatures, so you're kind of fundamentally set up well to battle over planeswalkers. And even if you aren't playing against decks like Fires that really struggle against just a handful of counterspells, I think the fundamentals of this deck in the classic matchup against Simic still good enough that this is a positive choice, even if it isn't as good as maybe it was last weekend.
Well, Emma, you're someone who's been kind of keying in on the Sacrifice decks recently. Now you've been messing around with Cauldron's Familiar and Witch's Oven and stuff like that. Any fear as a Jund Sacrifice player playing up against this style strategy? Because as we know, Peter Boglowski, playing Jund Sacrifice, beat Brad in the finals last weekend, so he knows that he can at least win with Jund Sacrifice against Simic Flash.
Yeah, we actually saw on Sunday Canister beat up on everyone who brought the Flash deck.
Yeah.
He beat Seth Manfield, he beat Javier Dominguez, and he beat Brad Nelson on the way to winning. Kind of the key there is being able to go under it and establishing these synergies through Trail of Crumbs, Cauldron Familiar, and Witch's Oven to just force them to actually react to what you're doing, and then using those pockets to kind of push your own synergies even further. I really like the Jund Sacrifice matchup
For Jund Sacrifice?
Right.
Okay, fair enough. Well, we're going to get the Jund Sacrifice right now, which is the deck that did win Mythic Championship 3. That's an Izzet Delver. We'll get there, I promise. Jund Sacrifice deck that did win Mythic Championship 7 in the hands of Peter Goglowski. This deck is powerful. There's a lot going on here. Edgar Magayesh is going to be playing this deck. You see the 4 Cauldron Familiars, Gilded Goose, an additional copy of Korvold, where Goglowski, better known as Canister on Magic Online, was only playing 2 Korvolds. Edgar has moved into 3. Mayhem Devil, Thrashing Bronzodon in the main deck, 4 main deck copies of Casualties of War, and as Emma, as you did mention, Trail of Clumps, Witch's Oven as well, kind of the engines of this deck. So this thing is pretty complicated, but once the ball gets rolling, it's pretty hard to stop it.
Right. The idea here is you just always have ways to proactively use your mana. It's something that we see out of these Nissa and these Hydroid Krasis decks, but rather than having a bunch of cards that contribute to that strategy, it kind of leans on having 1 or 2 cards that are able to push it really far over the top, whereas the Jund deck is just going to play cards that all generate more cards and lock up the battlefield.
This deck is interesting because, Matthias, it's doing so many different things that sometimes you feel like the draws aren't going to come together very well, but Trail of Crumbs really is the glue that holds this entire deck together. Korvold is a great payoff, and then Casualties of War at the very, very top end means that you can answer a lot of different things. So Casualties of War against these Simic decks is just okay. Not the big ace in the hole, because it's very, very good in the mirror, as an example.
Yeah, Casualties of War is there, I think, because you didn't know the metagame. Certainly if the Jund Sacrifice players knew it was all going to be all Simic, maybe we would have seen some different numbers on it. But at the same time, this still looks to be pretty good. I mean, you're playing Jund Sacrifice in a field of all Simic decks, and blue-green decks just in general aren't great at answering permanents. So when you have a deck that says once it gets 3 or 4 permanents on the battlefield, it starts becoming unbeatable. This is a pretty good field to be in. Yeah, I think something a Jund Sacrifice deck would be scared more of is, let's say, if there were a bunch of questing beasts in the field or a bunch of just like aggro and attack decks, maybe there's a window there, but not having to deal with that is going to be a pretty good spot for these players.
Yeah, I think this is good news for the Jund Sacrifice players here this weekend. There are only 4 of them. We mentioned there's 7 Simic Ramp and then 4 Simic Flash players. For Jund Sacrifice, it's hard to pick against the deck that just won the Mythic Championship, right?
Yeah, and if you want to talk about the absence of aggressive strategies, I think a lot gets made of the Simic decks. I've never found those matchups to be all that challenging. It's this right here. The combination of Witch's Oven and just creatures in general, even if you don't have the best energies, really hard thing to slog through. This deck is very good at getting on the battlefield. Counter spells are broadly pretty weak against this deck because you have so much that's good for 1 mana that gets underneath of it. Yep. And then a lot of your more expensive cards, the value over replacement isn't that high. It's not like you have these key pieces that if they get countered, it's the end of the world for you. So I think your matchup against the Simic Flash style decks is going to be naturally very good. And I think the ramp deck, the matchup is not bad as well. They ostensibly go over the top of you, but if you're able to resolve your spells, you can keep up with them on terms of battlefield presence and sort of raw power. And you're also getting underneath the game in a way that forces them to play their cards at inopportune times, makes it harder for them to leverage their planeswalkers. I think this is still a great choice for this weekend.
Yeah, this was the deck when Manguchi, talking to him at Mythic Championship 7, he built Simic Ramp and played it with the idea of being able to take care of Jund Sacrifice, but his losses were actually coming in that deck when we were in Long Beach last weekend. So, how does that matchup play out? I think you are right insofar as these Jund Sacrifice decks can actually kind of go toe-to-toe with the Simic Ramp deck, especially once you have Trail of Crumbs going to find the pieces to the puzzle, because once a card like Mayhem Devil's in the battlefield, it's not leaving the battlefield.
And really good news that there's the absence of fires this weekend for this deck as well. I think if there's any vulnerability this deck has, it's sort of a ponderous, like, I'm setting up shop, I'm doing some fair stuff, it's very efficient, but it's fundamentally fair. Someone going way over the top very early on in the game is not the type of thing this deck is equipped to handle. The complete absence of that archetype from the Players' Championship field, I think, is very good news for them.
No fires have been mentioned decks, but there is one adventure player here this weekend. It is Chris Barone, our Season 2 Invitational Champion, and he is playing the more aggressively slanted version of Golgari Adventures. You see the Rotting Regisaurs, the Lovestruck Beast, the Questing Beasts as well. Vivian, Arcbow Ranger, the Great Henge. This might look familiar for those of you who did watch coverage of Mythic Championship 7 because it was played by the one and only Chris Kvartek, Emma, who has been taking kind of Magic by storm over the course of this year. We said that there's really no aggressive decks in the format. This is our one aggressive deck in the metagame here this weekend. Any chance this does well?
I absolutely think so. So one of the big draws to an archetype like this is the card Rotting Regisaur. So normally that card's going to have a drawback in your mid-range decks where you want to have a mass of cards. You don't want to just be behind on that the whole game. But when you mix that with things like the Great Hinge, Edgewall Innkeeper, and so on, you end up having a surplus of cards relative to the amount of mana that you can actually invest into them. So your opponent is kind of losing on both ends of card advantage and on the battlefield. And we've mentioned it a couple times now where these blue-green decks are going to struggle to answer permanents. So when you actually just put a 7/6 onto the table, you're going to be so far ahead that they're going to struggle to keep up. And a lot of these Simic decks are not great when playing from behind.
Yeah, I mean, the Simic decks, Patrick, at the end of the day, they do have difficulty getting things on the battlefield. And Emma, as you mentioned, they're not great at playing from behind. So Edgewall Innkeeper is a card that you want to kill. Rotting Regisaur is a card that you want to kill. Vivian Arpo Ranger is a card that you want to kill. And for the Simic Flash deck, they have to counter that stuff. But for Simic Ramp, they have to go over the top of it.
Well, and if you're looking at matching up against Simic, one of the weaker things to do is play with creature removal. They're not really about their creatures. They draw a lot of extra cards, and particularly with the Flash style strategy, trying to leave up 3 mana against a person who can do other things with their mana is really inefficient. That's never been a way to approach a matchup like Fairies, and that's kind of the way that the Simic deck plays. Where the Adventure deck comes in is really exploiting people who do not have removal, because you have a 1/1 for 1 that if it survives, you're going to draw a bunch of cards. You have a 7/6 for 3. If you're not coming to the table with Terminates are very good against these cards. No one has them, and so I think that's the sort of the place in the metagame you're trying to exploit playing a deck like this.
And that's what kind of makes this tournament interesting with IS, is that things are, for lack of a better term, inbred about what, you can make predictions on what people think they're going to bring. And so for Chris, he made the conscious decision of bringing this deck, probably assuming there's going to be some heavy number of Simic decks, which he got right. There's no Fire of Inventions decks, which, okay. And then there's a couple Gen Adventure decks. I don't know how he feels about his matchup against those strategies, but if he was looking to play against a lot of Simic decks, he's going to get the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, right. We have 11 Simic decks in the field, and our 5 non-Simic decks, the 4 Gen Sacrifice and the 1 Golgari Adventure decks, all seem to have Simic in mind.
Yeah.
Even Simic Flash, that's a deck that you play because you think Simic Ramp is going to be a big deck. So honestly, I know I said this earlier, I still think this is going to come down to 7 players chose to play Simic Ramp, and I think they might be our weakest positioned players in Standards, because I think the other 9 players showed up to beat Simic Ramp.
Well, we're going to have to see how that portion of the tournament does unfold when we get to it. But for now, we're going to take a short break here from the Star City Game Center in Roanoke, Virginia. And when we do come back, we'll start breaking down the modern portion of our tournament. A lot more decks to check out there just a bit. Welcome back, everybody, to the pregame show of the StarCityGames.com Players Championship here at the Star City Game Center in Roanoke, Virginia. Cedric Phillips, Patrick Sullivan, Matthias Hunt, and Emma Handy bringing you coverage all weekend long, all 3 days of this week. And before we crown our champion here at the Players Championship, 16 competitors, $50,000 on the line. They're going to be playing some Modern here this weekend as well. Take a look at our Modern metagame breakdown. This was, for me, the most surprising, given what we have seen over the course of this year on the SCG Tour. Once Urza got printed, we saw Team Lotus Box and many others take serious advantage of that card. I suppose after the banning of Hogak, but you know, that was bound to happen. Anyway, Stoneforge Mystic got unbanned, but one thing I did not see coming here, Emma, and I'm going to start with you, was Devoted Devastation being the most played deck here this weekend, or even really being played at all, because it really hasn't put up a ton of results over the course of the weekend. I know we've got 4 players playing it, and we'll take a look at a deck list of it here in just a moment, but tell me about what's going on with this choice.
So this is the deck that a lot of Team Lotus Box has chosen to bring. That's the Devoted Devastation deck, and I think this is, in a lot of ways, a sign, a great show of humility.
Okay.
In where let's go back to the last Open in Atlanta about a month ago. We saw Matthew Clutter reach the top 8 of that Modern Open, kind of slicing through Team Lotus Box's Simic Urza deck. Just absolutely beat the brakes off of them. We covered them a couple of times, and it just never looked close. It's something that the Simic Urza deck is not very good at interacting with. And after the showing that Urza put up at the Invitational, I believe they were just gunning for that, and they kind of thought, all right, well, how did we get defeated when we broke it with this? And they just kind of took the play out of someone else's book and are running it here.
I mean, Matthias, do you think that the players here thought that there was going to be a lot more Urza, and so some players wanted to go towards Devoted Devastation and take advantage of all the Urza they thought was going to be here that's actually not here? Like, what happened here?
Well, I think that absolutely can be the case. Going into this, if you were to ask what the best cards or the best deck in Modern is, Urza is going to come back as the answer. It has Urza, it has Mox Opal, Oko, Emery. This deck's really good. It is the deck.
The deck is completely absurd.
The deck's absurd. So at that point, you either want to play it or you want to try to beat it. And one of the ways I think, if you want to approach from a combo, from a non-interactive point of view, I think the best decks right now tend to be really heavy on blue cards, which means spell-based combo is going to be difficult because blue cards tend to be pretty good against that. So, something like a Storm deck might not be as good. But creature-based combo is going to be something these decks really struggle to deal with. And Devoted Devastation, just the Devoted Druid combo deck in general, due to cards like Once Upon a Time being printed, it's gone from being one of the, a medium speed combo deck now just actually being one of the faster combo decks. So you have a fast combo deck, you have decks that aren't going to interact with it. And to be fair, I don't think our Snowblade decks do particularly better in interacting with it. I think this is a great choice this weekend.
Yeah, how do you feel about this choice, Patrick? Because it's really taking me by surprise here.
I think it's an excellent choice, and I think there's some analogs to what we saw in Standard. It's not that good to kill stuff. That's certainly not the way to address Urza as a strategy. They can accumulate a lot of cards. There's very rarely a key piece. Even if you kill an Urza, let's say, they still have a lot to show for it. There are a lot of ways in Modern to kill people really quickly if they're not good at killing creatures. So why do something like this instead of, let's say, Infect or Affinity? Mm-hmm. Well, the Urza deck can still block, still has some stuff on the battlefield. And some builds of it can even go to something like Thopter Sword and completely circumvent any sort of attacking measures. So what makes sense to me about Devoted Devastation is it's a deck that's exploiting the fact that no one can kill anything, and the ostensible defensive measures that Urza decks have, blocking, gaining life, doesn't work here. It operates completely outside of combat. So these Urza decks that can't kill anything are really defenseless against this sort of strategy.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? When you're working on a small field tournament like this, you can analyze, the players that are playing in the tournament, right? And if you take a look at these 16 players, I think there's really only one player who you would think would play Burn, which is Collins Mullen.
Right.
Now, he's gotten other Lotus Box players who play Burn, like we saw at SCG Dallas earlier this year, where they kind of destroyed that tournament. But if you assume that a deck like Burn's not going to be very popular, then you can go towards Devoted Devastation. You play Burn more than anybody, obviously.
This matchup is a joke.
Burn would destroy it.
It's not. It is turn 1 Temple Garden, and any card they play is like all right, well, what am I going to do on my break? I'm going to have 40 minutes here. Do I have enough time to go down the street and get a cup of coffee?
Sure.
But yeah, again, that's part of the PC experience. It's a small field. It's not this normal aggregation of metagame data. Mm-hmm. It's 15 human beings, you know them pretty well. And if you have a sense of what they are willing to play and the bright lines around the things they don't play, we've seen some pretty wild metagame exploitation in that vein over the years. This isn't the most outrageous thing. This deck has a certain amount of cachet at this point. It's popular for reasons that are well established, but they are definitely trying to exploit the fact that a lot of the fringe elements of the format that this deck doesn't play very well against probably won't be present.
Yeah, and I think even then, you talk about the specific players in the field. We look at the general tendencies in Modern of these players. There aren't a lot of Thoughtseize mages who qualified for the Players' Championship this year.
Also true. Also very, very true. So it's very clear, I think. You can kind of draw inside the lines of what players are going to play, put them on a range of stuff, and you can certainly identify what they're not going to play. Bant Snowblade, our second most played deck here in the Modern portion of things. We'll take a look at one of these deck lists as well. Stoneforge Mystic got unbanned, and now we kind of see players still trying to figure out the best way to go about doing business with it. Joe Lissette, our defending champion, coming back from winning in 2016, the last time we had one of these, is up to no good with this deck. He does have Arkham's Astrolabe, Ice Fang Coatl, Stoneforge Mystic, Jace the Mind Sculptor, Oko. I'm curious Joe's opinion on Oko. He's probably going to make good use of that over the course of the weekend. Path, some equipment. This one's slow. Very Joe-type deck here, I would say, because you can't really play a pure control deck. But Joe knows his way around a Stoneforge Mystic and a Jace, my friend.
Yeah, he does. There's a lot of really strong flash creatures.
Yep.
Now that you compare alongside Stoneforge Mystic and counter spells, you have an architecture in place to do that sort of thing now. And another place where people have tried to exploit the Urza decks, for better or worse, to varying degrees of success, is there's a lot of air in them. They've only got a handful of payoff cards. And sometimes just a couple counter spells and a path can fend off everything they're doing. And then you're expecting the rest of your strategy to kind of do the heavy lifting in matchups that are about removal and card advantage.
Is this a good matchup against Devoted Devastation? This looks like this would be favorable for Devastation, given the things that we mentioned previously, which they don't really have a lot of creature removal. Joe has Path. Not much else past that.
Joe's playing Miracles.
And this is Miracle-esque.
It's the closest thing you're going to find in any other form.
Yeah, this feels like kind of the analog to Miracles in some respects.
Yeah.
And I think the deck is similar and the strategy is similar, which is why we see a player like Joe Lissette going toward it. My concern would be is that the format is different. So it's maybe the deck does similar things, but a lot of times when you learn a deck, especially a player like Joe, who really learns high repetitions of all his matchups, in Modern, the kind of this like very slow grind out Stoneforge Mystic strategy, games don't always go to these turn 12s or 15s like they sometimes do in Legacy Blue Mirrors.
Sure. Any follow-up thoughts here for you?
Just that you do have the equipment can do a little bit of lifting in that sort of matchup in terms of accelerating your clock. So you aren't just back on your heels the whole time trying to fend off everything, which is really challenging. But you would like to have a little bit more removal for the Devastation matchup, certainly.
Okay, fair enough. We're gonna get to Urza strategies now. I'm gonna be coming to you in just a second. Bant Urza and Sultai Urza are our Urza strategies here in the room this weekend. So notably, we're not seeing just kind of straight Simic Urza. You see Abe Corrigan here. He's got Spell Queller. Looks like some players are putting a priority on that card here this weekend. Engineer Explosives, Cryptic Command, Gilded Goose. Let me see. My Oko's in here? Oh no. Okay, I guess we cut Oko for Queller. Interesting. Okay, I'm a little surprised by that for the Bant version of this deck. There's also a Sultai version of the deck that's being played here this weekend by a couple of players. But Emma, I'm going to come to you really quickly. Look, we have seen Urza decks for about half the year now, I think. Maybe a little.
Something in that area.
Yeah, around half the year. We know Urza's incredibly powerful. Maybe the most powerful card, and this is maybe the most powerful deck, but maybe the numbers aren't as high as we were expecting coming into the weekend.
Yeah, so in any event like this, it's small, the metagame's exploitable, there are decks to beat, and there are decks you play. And this is a situation where people are wanting to beat the best deck rather than play the best deck. So that's going to kind of account for a lower number of Urza decks. In an open field, you're going to want to just play the best deck because you never know what you're going to play against. But here, you kind of have that idea of what you're going to be playing against. We see a lot of the people who are playing these Urza decks leaning towards more interactive versions of the deck, and that's sort of a concession to them trying to be a little bit better against the decks that would otherwise beat up on them. We see things like main deck Assassin's Trophy in order to combat things like Devoted Devastation, like Infect, that we've seen people bring to the table to try and attack the Urza deck, rather than things like Karn the Great Creator that we saw at the Invitational.
Yeah, or maybe they went a little too deep at the Invitational. Hard to say. I mean, still good results for those players. Matthias, I'll ask you. Urza was kind of perceived to be the best thing going on. Emma, as you mentioned, players were trying to more or less, looks like, try to beat the best deck as opposed to play the best deck. Do you think that's the right approach for this tournament?
A lot of times in these kind of tournaments, I think your level 2 strategy where you're trying to beat the level 1 deck as opposed to play it, I do like that approach to it. I think in Standard that really happened where we have a level 1 deck and then a bunch of level 2 decks, and we're seeing some of that in Modern too.
Patrick, for you, look, this is the deck that probably plays the most powerful cards. Mox, Urza, Emery, all this other stuff. But only 4 players, if you split it up between 2 Bant and 2 Sultai versions of Urza, among the 16 are kind of doing this thing, which is a little surprising, at least to me, because that's the same number of people that are doing the Devoted Devastation thing.
Well, I think the incentive structures in the Player Championship are a little bit different, and my other commentators here touched upon this, where when you're playing in these Opens or even Invitationals, it's a ton of rounds. And often, if you're good enough to qualify for the Players' Championship, the players you're playing against in the Open are substantially weaker than you are. So it's just leverage that. Play a deck that's extremely good and play it well, and you're going to rack up a bunch of wins. We can call it the Danny Jessup. He's been doing that for years, and a lot of other players.
I love calling it the Danny Jessup.
Sure.
Here, your edge, whatever play skill edge you have, is much lower. And there's just sort of a cap on how well you can play the best deck relative to your opponents. So you've got to come up with a different edge. I think coming in here and just playing a couple stock lists and trying to play them well, that's a great strategy for an Open, even an Invitational. Here it doesn't cut it. It's a lot more about trying to, find the gaps in people's strategies. We've seen over the years, Jim Davis's win involved a lot of unorthodox strategies. We've seen Reduke have a Peacekeeper in the sideboard because he knew that Tom Ross was going to be playing Miracles. And those players have performed well for themselves. Much better over the years than the players who are maybe middle-of-the-road players in terms of skill among the PC field playing good stock lists. Just doesn't get it done here. The Urza deck's still very powerful, but I would be extremely concerned in coming in a tournament like that, playing a deck this visible against opponents with this sort of pedigree.
Well, a couple of odds and ends that we're going to go over here very quickly. We've got a couple of players playing Humans here this weekend. One of them, unsurprisingly, is Chris Barone. Chris winning the Season 2 Invitational as that being his Modern deck of choice. Drake Sasha, the other person playing this. I'll only take one quick one here. So for Emma, from you, this is as straightforward as can be. And Drake, I don't like those Militia Buglers, buddy. I'm just going to put that out there. You already know that, though. Why Humans? Why do you think it's a good choice?
Kill him.
Okay.
That's all there is to it. It's a consistent deck. It's able to attack things. Even if you are expecting people to make metagame calls, but you don't know exactly where people are going to end up, this is kind of just a safe pick, right? It's proactive. It's able to disrupt things that are super linear with things like Meddling Mage, Kitesail Freebooter, and so on. This is just sort of I don't necessarily know how other people are going to metagame, but I recognize other people will metagame, so how am I not just going to be a fish and bring whatever the deck is and get metagamed myself?
Sure, that makes total sense. Sasser, someone who has won a Modern Open earlier this year with Gift Storm. His range has been somewhat wide in Modern. I know he does like Storm strategies, but going towards Humans, a deck that generally has actually a good matchup against Storm. So we'll see how that ends up working out for him. We also have Amulet Titan. Oh, who could be playing that? Any guesses, Matthias?
I believe it's Matthew Dills. Though to be fair, we have Zach Allen and Edgar in the field. So
That's
there could
true.
have been more. No, we have 2 Primeval Titan decks in the field. We have Dilks on Amulet Titan, and we also have a Titan Shift deck. I believe it's Dom Harvey playing that.
We'll be getting to him in a second.
My general thoughts with Primeval Titan in this field, if you're trying to metagame a small field, these ramp-style strategies, the fairly polarizing matchups, is a great risk to take. It's the kind of deck you could hit or miss in this field, but unfortunately, when I look at the metagame, I think it's going to be a miss. There's no one playing Tarmogoyfs in this field. There's 4 people playing Devoted Druid combo, which is a terrible matchup for Primeval Titan decks.
Matchup,
they play a 2-drop, then you play a Farseek, and then you lose. There's some issues here. I really think, registering Titan to try to meta the field is a great strategy, but I don't think it's going to pan out for either of our 2 Titan
I'll
players.
ask a quick question about Matthew Dilks and his choice to play this deck. So in a tournament like this where, so if all 4 of us were preparing for the tournament and we're saying, okay, what's Dilks going to play in Modern? Okay, he's going to do this thing. Would it affect your playing in a certain way, Patrick? Or and also if you're Dilks preparing for the tournament, should you have considered something else, or just say, I'm going to play what got me here, and I can probably still beat people anyway?
Well, I got a little insight into that one. I ran into Dilks at the Invitational. I forget exactly what he played in Modern, but I know it was not Amulet Titan.
Okay.
And I picked him to win the whole event, and just assuming that he'd be doing this. And he was apoplectic with rage that he did not play Amulet Titan instead of whatever deck. So I think there could be a little bit of buyer's remorse on the Invitational there, informing this decision a little bit. It would certainly affect how I metagame, because there are a lot of cards in Modern that you can have in your sideboards that are similar but not exactly the same. And do you want to have Blood Moon as a hate card, or do you want to have a different anti-card that maybe is better against Tron or something else?
Sure.
Having Dilks in the field would definitely inform that decision for me. We haven't gone a deep dive into people's sideboards, but it wouldn't surprise me if on the edges people made some calls that you could go, 6 of one, half dozen of the other, but with Dilks being in the field and the expectation that he's going to play Amulet Titan, you go one way instead of the other. Yeah,
that does make some sense. 2 other odds and ends. We're going to go to 4-color Death Shadow very quickly here. Death Shadow is a deck that we have seen do very, very well in Modern, in Grixis varieties. Jund sometimes with Temur Battle Rage kind of throughout the deck list. You see 2 main deck copies here. You can play that across basically all the colors. Death Shadow has kind of gone up and down and all around in this format, Patrick. I know you've been a fan of this deck at certain times because the spells are cheap and there's interaction. Matthias, you mentioned there's not a ton of Thoughtseize decks out here, but we at least have one. Patrick, what do you think about this choice here from Jonathan Hobbs?
I think there's some analogs to what Emma was talking about with the metagame decision to play humans. It can be the best of both worlds, where if you're wrong, it's not by much, and it's possible that the choice is excellent. I'm a big advocate for playing this strategy sort of agnostic of the particulars of the metagame. It just plays a bunch of the format's best cards. You can toggle the deck, main deck and sideboard, to either be more about removal or more about the fast combo kills. And again, I think with the exception of Dilks, that matchup's quite bad, in my opinion, but a lot of the Urza decks, a lot of the decks that the level 2 stuff that people would bring to respond to it, it's hard to imagine that you're worse than a coin flip. And there's going to be a lot of opponents who just don't have a sideboard for you, that they're really gunning for a lean, really solid field of particular styles of Urza and combo decks. And post-board, I think Hobbs has a shot of getting really the better of it kind of across the field.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that Death Shadow does have going for it. And last, but certainly not least, Matthias, I'm coming to you, buddy. The other Primeval Titan deck here in Titan Shift with Dominic Harvey. I'm not sure how this is going to look now, given what people are playing.
This is a rough one. It's good for Dominic that 2 players decided to register humans. That's more than he probably expected, and he certainly won't be regretful about that. That's a fine matchup. But when you look at the rest of the field here, this is going to be a difficult.
I want to bring that graphic up one more time, real quick. All right. Okay, all right. Because normally Titan Shift has bolts or some way to interact.
Right. So sometimes you'll see, so with Titan Shift, you have about 6 main deck flex slots, which are all over the place. So you'll see Anger of the Gods main, sometimes Sweltering Suns main, sometimes Lightning Bolt main. What Dominic has done here is he's gone for 3 Veil of Summers in the main deck, which, to be fair, there are a lot of blue decks, but the blue decks aren't exactly counterspell decks. So you're right. When I said he had a good humans matchup, and I guess you're right. I have to back it up and say he didn't play. Yeah, I don't know if I like that matchup anymore. He doesn't have the main deck sweeper. His other flex slots, it looks like he put a 2 Hour of Promise in, which just gives you more redundancy, a little less interaction. If that's the strategy you want to go, just to be like this non-interactive deck trying to force its game plan through, I'm concerned he just has a bad version of Devoted Devastation.
That was what I was going to say, is I'm looking at the deck list, and actually I hadn't even realized that there was a lack of, because I'm just assuming to see a red spell in the graphic of Lightning Bolt. It's kind of a 3 or a 4 up to be able to interact in some sort of meaningful way. That means that once a Devoted Druid just gets cast, it's just there.
It's confusing to me. If you want a mono-green combo ramp deck, which is a thing you can do, if you want a mono-green combo deck, I would have preferred Devoted Devastation. If you just want a mono-green ramp deck, I would have looked toward Tron.
A deck that he's played. Right. A deck that he's won an open with. He won an open with in Columbus during Hogak Summer with
and
Tron.
Regionals.
Right. So I'm not sure.
And regionals, yeah.
If you're not going to play any of the red spells and any of the removal, I don't see the edge the Titan Shift has over Tron.
Yeah, that could be the weak portion of his tournament. I think, based on how the other decks look here. So we'll have to see if Dom can then get out of the Modern portion live if he does make it that far into the tournament. That said, we're going to take a short break here, and we're going to get ready to take a look at Legacy, our first format of the day. So we'll see you back here from the Star City Game Center in Roanoke, Virginia in 3 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. StarCityGames.com Players Championship pregame show here from the Star City Game Center in Roanoke, Virginia. Cedric Phillips, Patrick Sullivan, Matthias Hunt, and Emma Handy. We're bringing you coverage for the next 3 days to crown our Players Championship winner. Someone's walking out of here with a championship belt and a cool $20,000. Could be Joe Lissette. He could repeat here this weekend. And we know Joe loves the format that we're about to cover here in Legacy. See exactly what players have brought to the table. And if you thought seeing Devoted Devastation on top of Modern was a bit of a surprise, this one was even more surprising to me. First of all, it's very diverse. But more importantly, Hogak is the most played deck here in combination with Salt Ice Snow. Now, at our Legacy Open in Syracuse, Tarek Patel brought Hogak. And I think we watched him once on camera, Patrick, and we covered him. I think he lost that match that we watched. But he ended up making top 8 of the tournament. Didn't win the tournament, actually lost in the top 8 pretty quickly, and then, shuffled his way on out the door. But as we know from Modern, Hogak was pretty busted. You got to play with Faithful Suiting. This one gets to play with Careful Study. You get better lands because you're Legacy and not Modern. You've got your Crab, your Bloodghast, your Hogak, your Vengevine, so on and so forth. And presumably, no one has Graveyard Hate, and if that's the case, this deck looks really good.
This thing is legit, and I've been playing against it on Magic Online since it came out. It's doing the Lord's work.
Man.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
It's not
Doing
honest.
someone's work.
It's an honest way to make a living, I suppose. Matchup's not good.
Yeah,
It's like how?
Or you're giving them the living. When people say make a living, you're supposed to get paid.
Yeah, I
in
know.
this,
There's
right?
something lost in translation there, and I'm sorting it out. But
It's Lord's work. It's very charitable to be playing Burn on Moto.
it is. It is. I only can do it so much nowadays. But
Sure.
this deck is very strong.
Yeah.
And it's, I think, something that people didn't necessarily appreciate about Hogak during its dominance in Modern was it was actually pretty resilient against little pieces of Graveyard Hate. Now, Leyline of the Void is problematic, and some of the more just cover everything cards were issues. But Surgical Extraction, that's a card you can play there.
Very beatable.
And if you look at these Legacy deck lists, most of the Graveyard Hate they have is a couple Surgical Extractions as a nod to Reanimator or some Loam strategies, because they're playing Delver of Secrets, and just what's the line? Well, this is good against graveyard stuff, and it's a spell, and I have stuff that cares about spells. All right, that's all there is to it.
Yeah.
That's not enough here.
Yep.
And I think this might end up being a fantastic metagame call if people don't have really the more over-the-top metagame stuff that you have available to you to fight the graveyard.
Hogak is a deck, Emma, you know very well from your Modern days of playing it. You're actually the reason I won that PTQ. You told me how to sideboard in the car, among other things, so thank you very much. How do you feel about this deck in Legacy?
It's actually incredible. I mean, we've already talked about it a little bit, but one of the nice things is that it just is so resilient even when there is Graveyard Hate. Let's look back to the Mythic Championship in Barcelona. Leyline of the Void was the most played card in that tournament, and several teams main decked it. Hogak was also the best deck in this event. It did the best by almost 5 percentage points or something in that range among the decks that, were represented by enough people and so on. So there's a point where, especially when people don't bring Graveyard Hate, you're just so far ahead. A lot of times people don't have priority to use something like Surgical Extraction by the time the Hogak is in the graveyard. You cast your Careful Study, you pitch your Hogak, you have turn player priority, and you just get to cast the Hogak while they stare at this useless Surgical Extraction in their hand.
Yeah, those things and those sort of interactions will happen a lot, and Leyline of the Void is a card that you do need to at least get the conversation started on trying to beat that deck. I do want to move towards Salt Ice Snow now here very quickly because we've got quite a few decks to go over here, and we do want to make sure that we start to bring some play to you fine folks at home that are watching this relatively soon. Matthias, I'm going to come to you here in just a second, but we take a look at this Salt Ice Snow deck list with Icefang Coldle. Gilded Goose has made its way to Legacy. Of course it has. Force of Will, Ponder, Veil of Summer 2, Arkham's Astrolabe. Looks like there's a Bitter Blossom and some other things tying the room together. It looks like a good stuff deck with some snow involved in it. Thoughts on this strategy?
So we had a deck like this, I believe it was at the last Players' Championship we had 3 years ago, where it was basically 4 Birds of Paradise, 4 Noble Hierarchs, and a lot of really powerful 3-drops. And that were, I think it was Deathrite Shamans at the time. But
Sure.
the idea was we have 1 mana creatures, then we play the best 3s we can find in the format. We kind of tie it together with whatever removal we need to have to make this work. This to me feels in a lot of ways like it's doing the same thing. And now that we have things like Renin 6 out of the format, I think is when it comes to fair decks, these Leovold, Oko, style strategies, they seem pretty good. If you just want to jam the best cards, you should have some game against most things. There is some metagame, I think, that's interesting with it. Right there we saw there's 3 Bitter Blossoms in the main of the deck list, which certainly is something we haven't seen a lot of in Legacy, but I like this strategy.
Yeah, I mean, this is an Oko deck, but just kind of a good card deck, Patrick, that we have seen in Legacy over our years and years of covering, and sometimes just good stuff is good enough.
Yeah, and I think the snow stuff, Legacy's already in a format where there's such a strong incentive to build your mana base around basics if you're trying to play anything expensive because of Wasteland, and you have the fetch lands to do that. So the infrastructure's already there for it to incorporate the snow cards very easily because you're just swapping out basic island for snow-covered island. The snow cards are very strong at a low opportunity cost, and they play very well alongside some of the format's best staples. So no surprise to see it represented here.
We'll go to Bant Snow next. Bant Snow is going to be like what you just saw with Sultai Snow. Going to be a little bit different, obviously, given the color combination. But what you're going to find here is a surprisingly main deck copy of Brazen Borrower. I mean, these look, Throne of Eldraine has some really powerful cards. Goodness. Oko in this deck, you see Council's Judgment hanging out, but this is mostly a blue-based strategy. You're going to have Swords to Plowshares as a 4 of. Jay, Snapcaster Mage, Emma, just another good stuff deck, something that Edgar and Maggie H likes to do quite a bit.
Yeah, so this deck is kind of rather leaning into the black cards. It leans into the synergy of Teferi Time Raveler with all these enters the battlefield creatures. It's very good with Icefang Coatl, which kind of serves as this deck's Baleful Strix. It's very good with Snapcaster Mage, obviously. It also just turns off a lot of cards in the format. You'll see a lot of Force of Wills and things like that people want to try and fight against these value plays to counter them before they generate their enter the battlefield things. And Teferi just kind of stops that. And then couple that with the fact that Swords to Plowshares gives it the time to actually use all of this stuff. It's easy to see why they're drawn to this deck.
Yeah, I mean, this is a different version than what we saw, but I think Teferi is pretty important to mention because once it's on the battlefield, it's going to change the way the games are going to be played moving forward. And of course, Swords to Plowshares is a nice way to just buy yourself a little more time in combination with Snapcaster Mage. So there's Bant Snow, 2 players playing that. 2 players also playing Bant Miracles as well, since its Vine Top is long gone. Thank goodness for those of us who do coverage for a living. But this deck certainly can be very powerful. You see the copies of Terminus. You've got Teferis here. You've got Okos as well. Brainstorm. Accumulated Knowledge might be worth noting there, Patrick. 4 copies of that there for Harlan as well. But we're looking at a Miracles deck with a minor splash.
Well, that is, it's not as intense as some of the decks that we've seen, but main deck Accumulated Knowledge is absolutely a metagame call, signaling some knowledge of the the PC field rather here, being a lot of slower blue-based decks. That card is very slow, but extremely powerful in any sort of slow, grindy matchup. I think that a lot of viewers at home have probably not played formats where Accumulated Knowledge was a prevalent feature. I have. If you're playing, if you are playing a blue mirror and you have Accumulated Knowledge and someone else does not, that is a major, major advantage. So I like I said, not exactly as extreme as, like, let's say a Peacekeeper in someone's sideboard, or not as loud as that. But Harlan definitely suggesting that he doesn't think the format's going to be that combo-oriented, that it's going to be more about grinding out these blue mirrors, and he should have an edge there.
Yeah, I actually think this is pretty interesting. The 3 decks we've talked about here, all to me, they are the same shell with different approaches on how they want to win these fair deck mirrors. And we see Accumulated Knowledges in this Miracles deck. We saw Bitter Blossoms in the black version, and then we're seeing Teferis in the Bant version. And what I actually think is going to be interesting is it's like each of these cards to me feel like they're working toward the same goal. And I think some of these plans might just be better than the other ones, and that's going to play out over the weekend.
I got 6 1-ofs. I'm going to start with a deck that is back because Renin 6 is no longer here. That's Death and Taxes, I believe. We'll get to that in just a moment here in the hands of Colin Roundtree. So, look, Renin 6 was causing some problems for this deck because it has plenty of 1-toughness creatures. But with that deck, with that card being banned, perhaps this can come back now. I know this is a deck that I have been unkind to in the past because I can't win a match with it. It's more of a mono-white control deck, and I think it's pretty horrible. But ignoring my personal opinion, this deck actually wins a pretty fair amount. And when you think of the decks that are now available back in the format with Renin 6's banning, you have to certainly count this one because it generally does pretty good against these blue decks that are kind of doing nothing a lot of the time.
Exactly. This is a deck that things like Aether Vial, it's just absurd against this field. It's very good. Colin Roundtree in particular, he made the finals of a Grand Prix with this deck earlier this year, so he's no slouch with the archetype. And we also saw a duel at a recent Legacy Grand Prix where it is just kind of able to hang with things like Oko, which all Oko really does is try to gum up creature combat, right? And Death and Taxes, with its equipment package, with things like Flicker Wisp, it's the best at hanging in that sort of environment.
Yeah, I'm curious how this deck's going to line up against Oko, as you had mentioned, because that's a pretty prevalent card in our Legacy metagame here this weekend. We've also got 4-color Mentor in the hands of Oliver Tomiko. This one, Matthias, is a little all over the place. You mentioned how we have players like kind of with the same shell trying to win a certain kind of way. This one looks like it's trying to do it with Monastery Mentor as opposed to Bitter Blossom and some of the other options.
Yep, I think you're exactly right. This is the same kind of shell. It's Monastery Mentor, and then it actually gets to have main deck Veil of Summers and Pyroblasts. So to me, that's a very... it fits into, I think, a lot of the ways that Oliver, one of his strengths is Oliver is very good at tactical magic, so giving himself a deck full of lots of 1-mana instants, and then like cards that benefit doing that. Monastery Mentor, to me, seems like a really good way to approach the matchup.
Okay, next one of deck list we have Is It Delver? It's a little surprising to cover a Legacy portion of an event, and this is our first Delver deck that we're covering. You think of Teamer Delver, Jeskai Delver, so many different versions of Delver. This is the Is It version, Patrick, which is a little bit more burn heavy. I know you've played this a time or two. Drake Sasser's playing this weekend.
My biggest concern with this is this just does not look like a very good metagame for Wasteland. And I think the times where Delver's at its best are where you're expecting to play against a lot of decks that are just opening up on non-basics.
Sure.
These snow strategies, they don't really cooperate, and they can interact early and often. I mean, the deck's still chock full of extremely powerful cards. A lot of these blue decks that we see seem maybe a little too saturated with 3-mana cards generally. Even if you are not opening yourself up to Wasteland, are Spell Pierces and Daze just going to be good against you trying to resolve cards like Teferi and Oko? But it's not the field you would hope for if you wanted to play this sort of deck.
3 more 1-ups here. Grixis Delver is where we're going to go next. It's another Delver strategy that we're going to see here this week in the hands of Jonathan Hobbs. Hobbs is certainly on his own island doing his own thing here this weekend. Probably an underdog coming into the weekend, but look, the kid's has put up a lot of success with the things that have certainly worked for him, be it Death Shadow or Emma in this instance, playing this strategy here in Grixis Delver.
Right, so the specifics of Hobbs' list and looking back at Sasser's list, they're both very high on Dreadhorde Arcanist and Young Pyromancer, which almost serve very similar roles to the Planeswalkers we've seen in these grindier snow decks, where they're trying to generate this must-answer resource engine that's also a proactive permanent, and they are wanting to go under with things like Daze, right, to counter the 3-mana spells, and I think that they're going to get a little bit punished by the Swords to Plowshares and things like that we're seeing show up. But I can see how they arrived at this.
Okay. Fair enough. I mean, look, Delver has a pedigree of being very, very good in Legacy. I'm not sure how great it is nowadays because a lot has changed over the past calendar year with Throne of Eldraine and Modern Masters and all that stuff working itself into the format. So we'll see how things do go for Sasser and Hobbs. 2 more to go. Golgari Depths, no surprise here, Matthias. Matt Dilks is going to stick to what got him to the dance, Amulet Titan in Modern, and this deck here in Legacy.
I do think there's some advantage here to this. The field is somewhat light on Wastelands. Wasteland's not good against the field, but also isn't being registered as much in the field. So if you are going to play Golgari Depths, a deck that relies on creating a 20/20 with a land, I think he might find some avenues to make this work.
And nobody plays it better on the SCG Tour than Dilks does. So this is a deck that he's had a ton of success with over the calendar year, so not much of a surprise to see him registering that. Again, I think it's an instance of players knowing he was probably going to do this, and he's just kind of saying, well, you've got 14 other people to worry about ignoring me, so if you want to prepare for me, go ahead. And I don't think many people have in this instance. And then for Chris Barone, he is playing Jeskai Miracles. We foreshadowed this a little bit here, but you see the counterbalances, the main deck copy of Dovin's Veto and Back to Basics. Patrick, it's a different take on Miracles. We have watched this deck plenty over the years. No more Sensei's Divining Top. But looks like a pretty normalized version, all things considered.
Yeah, my concern from Barone's side here is that the metagame is just full of Planeswalkers. Teferi, Time Raveler, and Oko are both not the ideal cards for Miracles to be playing against. If Teferi resolves, that's a huge problem for just fundamentally how you play Magic. And Oko is, toggling on, off, turning things into food, and then pressuring and answering some of your cards is a problem too. It would not be my metagame call coming in because there's a bunch of decks that can play a control game but also proactively generate threats that are really hard for you.
That is our metagame breakdown portion of the tournament. We did Standard, we did Modern, we did Legacy. If you head to the Star City Games website, we're going to have coverage of this event there. Nick Miller did his preview article with all the deck lists in it as well. And then our friends over at Cardboard Live and their app that's involved with Twitch will be able to show you the deck list as we do watch plenty of Magic to be had here shortly. But one thing we've got left to do here is make our predictions for who's going to win, as well as unveil the Legacy pods that'll be kicking off the tournament. We're going to be doing that right after this. All right, everybody. The metagame breakdown is done here on our pregame show of the StarCityGames.com Players Championship. Cedric Phillips, Patrick Sullivan, Thias Hunt, and Emma Handy are ready to unveil the pods here. That's going to kick off our tournament. We're going to kick things off with Legacy. And we're going to start here with the top seat A, number 1 here. Let's see who that's going to be. This is where Director Rob comes in. I don't want him to blow it. Okay, it's Joe Lissette. Okay, defending champion. Boom. First one in. Let's see who he's going to be going up against in his pot for Legacy. Oliver Tomiko, who many picked to win this tournament. He's had a heck of a year on the SCG Tour. Will be joining Joe alongside our Season 1 champion, Abe Corrigan. Okay. And then the last person in there is our SCG Tour Player of the Year, Zan Saeed. Okay, so that, Emma, is...
off to the races.
That is a pretty darn good pot. All right. Especially for Legacy, I think. Okay, so Joe, obviously, we know his Legacy background. Oliver... pretty good Legacy player. Abe, I think, maybe the least seasoned in Legacy of the 4. And then Zan, I mean, he's SCG Tour Player of the Year, so he's pretty darn good, too. I think so. So, Matthias, yeah?
Yeah, I think in that pod, the players we are looking at as the favorites to advance there are going to be Joe and Oliver. I think you're right, Zan's the Player of the Year, but there wasn't very much Legacy on the tour this year.
Yeah.
So I think we see Joe, who has a ton of Legacy experience, and Oliver, who has a lot of just experience in these blue mirrors. They're the players that I expect to see come out of the pod.
All right, let's go to pot 2. Take a look at this one as we fill in these circles and names and faces and all that jazz. We'll start off with, drumroll please, Matthew Dilks, who's playing Golgari Depths, as we know. So that's going to be in there. Let's see who he's going to be going up against. Jeremy Bertarioni, a player, Patrick, who you watch over the course of this year. You've become somewhat fond of him. He's actually built a pretty nice resume for himself.
Yeah, he's pretty funny.
That works, too.
I undersold. I didn't really talk to him a whole lot, but he's pretty funny. It counts a lot for me.
Funny works. Good at Magic, too.
Yeah, good at Magic. He's a funny guy.
Member of Team Lotus Box making it in here. Dylan Donegan as well. Someone who's got a lot of experience playing in Players Championship and SCG Tour events. And then last but not least is going to be Zach Allen. So as far as favorites are concerned here, this one's a little bit different, especially because I think Dilks is probably your most experienced player, but Donegan's had a lot of success in Legacy too, Patrick.
Oh, yeah. Donegan's done quite well for himself over the years in the format. That's a tough pod to call because we have kind of 2 largely unknown elements in that pod as it pertains to Legacy, whereas at least the Lotus Box players, they're sort of been probably are more just ambiently fluent with the mechanics of Legacy and the matchups. I would, if I had to pick one player to come out of that pod, it would be Dylan.
Okay, let's take a look at pod number 3. That'll be C, of course. We're going to kick things off with Chris Barone, a tough person to predict here, I'd say, this weekend. Won our Season 2 Invitational, and that's really all we know about Chris. So he's playing Jeskai Miracles. We'll go to our next player, and we will find that it is going to be Harlan Fear. Harlan, who's had a fantastic year, is playing Bant Miracles. We go to our third player in Pod C. That'll be Collins Mullen, who's had a heck of a year for himself as well, playing Hogak. And then last is going to be Jonathan Hobbs, who, let me make sure I get his deck list here very quickly, is playing Grixis Delver. So 4 very, very different decks. Emma, any picks on that one?
Yeah, I really just like the Hogak deck here, and I also really like Harlan's strategy here. Swords to Plowshare is going to be very strong against Hobbs, and I also just kind of want to give him the nod again in the heads-up control mirror there against Barone. I like accumulated knowledge more than I like predict.
Okay, totally fair. All right, last one here. These are our 4 last players in the tournament, so we'll go one by one very quickly. We'll start things off with Colin Roundtree, your Season 1 Invitational Champion, playing Death and Taxes. Got second place at Grand Prix Niagara Falls earlier this year with that deck. We go to Dominic Harvey, who is playing Saltai Snow here in the Legacy portion of the tournament. We go to our next name. That is going to be Drake Sasser, who has had a very, very strong win percentage against other PC players. Thanks to our friends over at Mox Insights for letting us know that. Playing Is It Delver. And then Edgar Magayesh, who is our last player, number 16. He is playing Bant Snow. Any predictions from anyone here about how that will go? Anyone want to chime in?
I actually like Dominic Harvey's chances a lot here. I think based on the decks we've seen here, against Is It Delver, I do like Dom's deck choice, and I think this is the kind of matchup where I've seen him really excel.
Okay, fair enough. Well, those are our pods when we can begin coverage here in just a moment, but we got to make some picks and let you know who we think is going to win this thing. Our classic case of doing pick'ems here, and hold on.
There.
Dylan Donegan. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. This is weird to say. he's one of the most experienced players in the field, because I think we've known Dylan since he was like 16 or something. And so to say that he's one of the most experienced players in the field, but I think he's 22 or 23 now, just finished college, is a weird thing to say. Joe's the most experienced player in the field.
Dylan's in the first Players Championship.
He was in the first Players
Yeah.
Championship, yes, which was in 2014. So it's weird to say that he's one of the most experienced players in the field. I think he's obviously good across all three formats. Has had a heck of a year. And I think this is really an opportunity for him to really shine here this week, and I like all three of his decks. And he's my pick to win the tournament. Patrick, to you.
Chris Barone
Okay.
covered the Invitational not that long ago. He rinsed that field, including many of the players that he's going to be playing against this weekend. Undefeated at the end of day one, first overall seed, and then I believe 9-1.
It was 9-1.
And I've been around long enough when I'm watching someone for the first time where, all right, is this a blend of fluke plus really good metagame call, or does this person know what's going on? He knows what's going on. And I think in a field like this where there's like really a social element to these players, they all interact with each other. There's a lot of metagaming that goes on because you know these players' tendencies. I think there is advantage to be a little bit on the outside looking in. How many people here made selections for their sideboard thinking about Oliver Tomiko or Dylan Donegan or Matthew Dilks versus Chris Barone? Could be literally an order of magnitude difference on those kind of calls. So I think the blend of sort of flying under the radar and what he showed me in the Invitational not that long ago gives him a leg up here.
Matthias, we go to you.
I think this event is about blue mirrors. We look at in Standard, we have all these Bant Ramp decks. In Modern, we have these Urza mirrors. And in Legacy, we're going to have all these Snow mirrors. And when I look at that, I want to go a player who I think can just crush it every format in blue mirrors against someone else. And I think when you could look at that style of play, that single turn play, how to navigate a bunch of instants, I'm looking at Oliver Tomiko. I think in those situations, he is the most impressive player in this field.
Emma, over to you.
So I'm just going to have to agree with Matthias here. I really like Oliver Tomiko in this field. He has the highest win rate in the field by a fairly significant margin. If you look at the Mox Insights piece that you referenced before, he doesn't have a bad win rate against basically the field. I really like the fact that he has chosen to attack the metagame rather than just play the decks to beat. I think on a macro level, he's just in a really good spot.
Fair enough. Nick Miller's our last person, and he, I believe, picked Edgar Magayesh, who's still looking for that big signature win, and this could be his opportunity to do it. So those are our picks here this weekend. First place of this thing, $20,000 championship belt. You see 1st through 16th. At the very least, people are walking out here with $500, but as Joe Lissette learned a handful of years ago, $20,000 and a big trophy is cool, and what he might learn this year is that $20,000 and a title belt is even cooler. There you do see the 2019 StarCityGames.com Players Championship belt. Winner's going to be walking out of that thing, assuming that Patrick doesn't take it before the tournament is over. No guarantee of
Big
that.
assumption.
Yeah,
Grudge match
quite
for
the
you out in the
Huge
parking lot.
assumption. I mean,
yes.
they know how to get it.
That's You've got burned all three formats.
Yeah.
See if anyone can beat you. With that, we're going to get set up here for our first match. Pregame show is in the books. We're going to watch Joe Lissette do battle against Zan Saeed in Legacy just a bit. See you soon.